Good afternoon and good morning for those of you around the country. My name is Doris Meissner. I'm a senior fellow here at the Migration Policy Institute and responsible for our U.S. immigration policy program and work. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. That's the webinar that we're calling Child and Family Migration to the United States, Continuing Flows and Evolving Responses. Now, the title of the webinar and the basis of the webinar, of course, is a crisis, a really humanitarian emergency that occurred last year, where the migration of child migrants as well as families into the United States reached historically high levels. As a result of a combination of aggressive responses by the U.S. government as well as governments in the region, including Mexico, the numbers abated by the fall. But many of the underlying issues that brought that emergency and those flows about remain. So our purpose today is to really take stock of this issue, especially at this time of the year, because this is the time of the year when these flows have typically begun to increase on the way to what have been record levels last year and peak levels in the years preceding that. So we're at a time now where the months ahead are very important in this story, and so we're going to look at the range of issues that are involved, relying on two people here at MPI that you know well. First is Mark Rosenblum, who's the Deputy Director of our U.S. Immigration Policy Program, and who will talk about the national and international issues. And that will be followed by Margie McHugh, who's the Director of our National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. She will be talking about the impacts and the special challenges for localities and how localities are responding to those who have already arrived. First, let me mention a few housekeeping items. The audio and the PowerPoint from the webinar will be on our website later today at migrationpolicy.org/events. If you have any technical problems as this webinar is going forward, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call us 202-266-1929. The best browsers to access the webinar are Google Chrome or Firefox. If you have problems hearing via the web, please dial in using the call information sent you via email. Finally, we will have a Q&A at the end of the call. There will not be a voice Q&A. Please feel free to type any questions into the Q&A or the chat box, which is on the right side of your screen. You can also email to events@migrationpolicy.org. We will be releasing a report on these issues later in the week, so you can be checking our website for that as well. So with those opening comments, let me turn to my colleague, Mark Rosenblum.
Thanks, Doris. Excuse me, with a lot of ground to cover, as you can see here in the overview slide, I'm going to jump right into talking about the child and family migration phenomenon in terms of the statistics on arrivals and trends that we've seen recently. And I'm going to start with a picture that you've probably seen a version of before. You may not have seen it with the FY 2015 numbers, but I want to direct your attention to several sort of important points about these data. So this shows annual apprehensions of unaccompanied children by nationality for the last 6 years. And let me make 4 observations about this figure. First, this dramatic increase that we've seen recently really began in 2012. We saw about a 50% increase between 2011 and 2012 in child arrivals, another 58% increase between 2012 and 2013, and then a 77% increase between 2013 and 2014. The second observation that you can see is that apprehensions of Mexican unaccompanied children have been flat over this time period. The bottom bands in those bars, the Mexican arrivals, have been totally flat. So this surge has been driven entirely by Central American arrivals. You can also see that the numbers have fallen substantially in 2015 the figure, adjusts for the seasonality. The numbers are way down from last year, but we're still on pace, as you can see, for 2015 to be the second highest number of child arrivals ever, slightly ahead of 2013. And then a final observation I want to point out is that when you look at that FY 2015 number, you can see that the drop-off has really been driven by falling apprehensions of Hondurans and Salvadorans. The Guatemalans, the apprehensions of Guatemalans in 2015 are essentially on pace with last year, but we've seen a significant decline in Honduran and Salvadoran unaccompanied children arriving. I'm just going to show you quickly. This map shows apprehensions in 2014 and 2015 of unaccompanied children. And so this sheds some light on the decreases that we've seen so far this fiscal year. And one thing I want to point out to you is that the apprehensions are actually up in the western sectors in San Diego and El Centro and Yuma. They're down in the rest of the country. They are particularly down in the Rio Grande Valley sector. That's the sector where 3/4 of all UAC apprehensions occurred last year. This is really where the phenomenon of Central American arrivals has been located. And so those numbers are way down, and they're down in that sector. One thing we want to watch for in coming months is whether we continue to see increases in the western part of the country, which would be, an alarming trend and suggest that children are adapting to increased enforcement. This figure just shows you monthly apprehensions, and I include it for a couple of reasons. One is to point out the seasonality that has existed for a long time. And what you see, if you can sort of zoom in, is that we have always seen numbers increase in March, April, and May. They've typically begun to decline in June, and the summer actually has not been, the spring has been the peak season. That pattern broke last year. Last year, the numbers continued to go up in May and June and remained high in July. And of course, they increased, much more dramatically than they had in previous years. So, one thing to take away from this figure is that the next 3 months, March, April, and May, we've got data through February. So right now is the moment when we'll see what this year is going to look like. So we're really eagerly awaiting additional data on UAC apprehensions in the next couple of months. Most of the attention during 2014 focused on increased arrival of unaccompanied children. What this figure shows you is that actually the arrival of family units, which essentially refers to mothers traveling with young children, had far more dramatic growth in 2014, 360% increase between 2013 and 2014. These numbers have fallen, but the numbers of family unit arrivals are basically on pace with child arrivals. So last year we saw about an equal number of family and child arrivals, and this year so far we're also on pace for an equal number. We don't have as much monthly data on the family units as we do on the children, but what you can see in this figure is that during the peak period of arrivals last year over the summer, we were actually seeing significantly more family unit arrivals than we were children. That peak of 16,000, I think that was in June, there was about 11,000 children who arrived that month. So the family units really surged very dramatically last year. So, we'll be watching to see how those numbers evolve in coming months as well. So let me give you some background on existing U.S. immigration laws and policies with respect to what happens when people arrive at the U.S. border. In general, unauthorized immigrants apprehended at the border are subject to being removed or returned. Formal removal is sort of these are both forms of deportation. Formal removal is a higher stakes form of deportation. DHS has broad authority to detain immigrants while they're in removal proceedings, while they're waiting to be potentially deported if they've been placed into removal proceedings. But unauthorized immigrants also are subject or may be eligible for relief from removal for humanitarian reasons. So, the two basic goals for when people are apprehended at the border are enforcement and protection. Enforcement is designed to deport unauthorized immigrants, most unauthorized immigrants, but the law requires that immigrants who meet certain humanitarian conditions be protected and permitted to remain in the U.S. And the two forms of humanitarian protection that are most important for the populations we're talking about are asylum and special immigrant juvenile status. Asylum is a humanitarian status that's granted to immigrants who have suffered past persecution or who have a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Special immigrant juvenile status is a form of humanitarian relief for children under the age of 21 who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent. People who meet either of those criteria are eligible to remain in the U.S. and to receive a green card and therefore eventually to apply for U.S. citizenship. So the process of determining who gets deported and who is eligible for humanitarian relief involves screening and adjudication to sort of sort people into those categories. That's a critical step. Adjudication is sort of the critical moment when we're able to meet both of those goals. For most people apprehended at the border, that process begins with the Border Patrol agent, and their fate is in the hands of a Border Patrol agent, because Border Patrol agents have the authority to deport people either formally through expedited removal or reinstatement of removal, or informally through voluntary return. In most cases, Border Patrol agents can do that without a person ever appearing before a judge, and that screening and adjudication happens, very quickly at the border. In the process of doing that, Border Patrol does go through certain screening questions to determine whether somebody may have an asylum claim. And if a Border Patrol agent determines that someone has an asylum claim, then they bring in the USCIS Asylum Corps. And these are specially trained humanitarian agents within USCIS that determine whether a potential asylum claimant has a credible fear of persecution, whether they may have a valid asylum claim. And if they determine that the person doesn't have a potentially valid claim, they go back to CBP and will be deported. If they do have a potentially valid claim, then they go before an immigration judge in the Department of Justice and the Executive Office of Immigration Review, and then they have a full hearing before an immigration judge to determine whether they're eligible for asylum. So it's a fairly involved adjudication process. The law describes special rules for unaccompanied children, as well as for and immigration policy also has special rules for families. With respect to children, the rules are in statute under the Trafficking Victim Protections Reauthorization Act of the TVPRA of 2008. And the TVPRA establishes different rules for children from contiguous countries, Mexico and Canada, and from all other countries. For children from Mexico, which is the contiguous country that's more likely to send unaccompanied children, CBP, the Border Patrol, goes through a screening exercise to determine whether a child has been a victim of severe trafficking, whether they may have an asylum claim, and whether they're able to make an independent decision to return to Mexico. Children who haven't been victims of trafficking and don't appear to have an asylum claim and can make an independent decision are informally returned to Mexico, usually on the same day that they're apprehended. For children who don't meet those criteria, and for all other unaccompanied children from other countries, including Central America, the TVPRA put into statute policies that had previously been part of a court decision, the Flores versus Meese decision in 1997, to describe a longer adjudication process. And under the TVPRA, for those children, the only thing that CBP does is determine that the person is an unaccompanied child, and then TVPRA requires that they immediately be placed in a formal removal proceeding, which shifts their case to an immigration court to allow a judge to determine whether they're eligible for humanitarian relief. And while they're awaiting that hearing, the law, TVPRA, requires that CBP and DHS transfer custody of the child to the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, and that ORR hold the child in the least restrictive setting that's in the best interest of the child. And in practice, what that usually means is that children are not detained in a government facility, but that they're allowed to be placed with a family member if one can be located, or into foster care while they await their immigration proceeding at immigration court. There's also been special rules in place for family units for children who arrive with their parents. And just quickly, that Flores decision that I mentioned before, between 1997 and 2005, was considered to apply to these children, and they were also held in the least restrictive setting in the best interest of the child, so typically released while awaiting an immigration hearing. In 2005, the Bush administration implemented a policy of detaining family units while they were as part of their secure border initiative. But the Obama administration in 2009 eliminated family detention and adopted a policy of allowing people to be released on bond or released on recognizance while they were waiting for an immigration hearing. In June of last year, at the height of the family arrivals, the Obama administration implemented a new policy of detaining family unit arrivals as part of an effort to discourage future family migration, to deter other families from coming. And just last month, a federal court in Washington issued an injunction to block that detention policy on the grounds that it denied due process to those families, and so that policy of sort of mandatory detention has been suspended. So what explains the recent surge? Why did we see so many more families and children arriving last year? Let me quickly say something about each of these bullets. And I think that, you know, if you've been following this, you've heard some of this before, but there's three big factors, that sort of structural push and pull factors that encourage people to migrate from Central America to the U.S. One of those factors is violence in Central America. The homicide rates in the three Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, are the number 1, number 4, and number 5 highest homicide rates in the world. 1 out of 5 people nationwide in those three countries were crime victims last year. And, you know, it's important to emphasize that the United States has played a role in violence in the region, both, you know, through our involvement in civil wars in the region, through the deportation of hundreds of thousands of criminals from the U.S. to the region, and because the U.S. is the consumer market that drives most of the drug trade that's involved in a lot of the violence. A second big factor is economic insecurity. A quarter of all children and youth in the three Central American countries are neither in school nor employed. 1 in 3 working people in the Northern Triangle has an income of less than $4 a day. So this is a big driver. And then a third factor is family reunification. About 1 in 5 Salvadorans, 1 in 10 Hondurans, and 1 in 15 Guatemalans live in the United States, but the overwhelming majority of them are either unauthorized or have temporary protected status. And in both of those cases, family members in the U.S. are not able to petition to bring their family members to the U.S. So family members who want to rejoin their families in the U.S., their only option is to come here illegally. A second set of considerations, or second factor that helps explain the recent surge are sort of unintended consequences of U.S. policy. There's been a lot of discussion of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that President Obama announced in June of 2012 as a driver of these UAC flows. That argument actually doesn't stand up very well to the evidence, and the main reason is that DACA was announced in June of 2012, but the surge, when you look at the monthly data, began in the spring of 2012, several months before DACA was announced. And the other reason to be skeptical of DACA is that DACA applies both to Mexican and to Central American kids, but all of the surge in arrivals has been Central American. So there's something besides DACA going on. But I do want to direct attention to the implementation of TVPRA, you know, as it's been implemented as a factor, because TVPRA requires most of these kids to go before an immigration judge, but because of inadequate investment in immigration judges and inadequate judicial resources and legal resources, the average processing time for children to complete immigration adjudication, or for people to complete immigration adjudication, as of February of 2015 was 483 days. And the average wait time, including cases that are still waiting, is almost 600 days. These waits have been actually longer for kids because they've been on what's called the non-detained docket. So the facts on the ground have been that children who arrive in the U.S., are placed with a family member under most cases and don't complete their immigration processing for 2 years or more. So this has sent a signal to the region that children who arrive at the border do get a free pass, even though they're not getting, a legal free pass. But that has had, important bad implications for immigration enforcement, because it has encouraged, once word got out, that has encouraged additional immigration. It's also been bad for protection, because it means that it entices children to take dangerous trips. And it also means that while children face these long 2-year wait times for a hearing, they're denied any kind of services, any kind of support services. So we're not, adequately protecting vulnerable populations, and we're not adequately meeting our enforcement obligations. And then a third factor that helps explain the recent surge is immigrant smugglers and social networks. The important point here to understand is that in recent years, smugglers have really changed their business model. And that's partly related to this decades-long successful effort to make it more difficult to cross the U.S. border to enter the U.S. border, illegally. As those prices have gone up, as it's become more difficult, the price of hiring a smuggler to get across the border has gone up, and smuggling operations have been increasingly professionalized and increasingly taken over by professional criminal organizations. In recent years, those criminal organizations have developed a new product line, which is marketing themselves to Central American kids, and that's been a great product. They're offering door-to-door services all the way to Central America, and the delays in the adjudication system means that they're able to offer children a money-back guarantee. Once they get them to the border, they're getting admitted and placed with a family member, and, from their sort of observational perspective, having sort of at least 2 years without being deported. And so by that time, the smugglers have sort of delivered their product and been paid. So there's been an interaction between those long adjudication times and this new smuggling business model. And here's where, there was a misinformation campaign intentionally by the smugglers to describe this process as sort of legal permission to remain in the U.S., a permiso to remain in the U.S. And that may, in fact, have been reinforced as news of the DACA filtered down to the region. So when we think about, what to do about this, let me emphasize that there are no easy solutions to responding to the Central American families and children, because this is a classic mixed flow. And what I mean by that is, because of the gang-related and other violence in the region, we estimate that half or more of the children and families arriving at the U.S. border in the last couple of years have had protection claims that may entitle them to asylum or to special immigrant juvenile status under existing U.S. law. There's a lot of valid humanitarian claims in this population. But it's also true that, given economic push factors and generalized violence and family reunification pressures, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, have incentives to migrate even if they don't have a humanitarian grounds for relief. Even before this recent surge, the Northern Triangle countries were 3 out of the top 4 countries after Mexico for unauthorized immigration to the United States. So these are longstanding issues, and they're not all humanitarian. So the fundamental policy challenge is how to facilitate humanitarian relief for those who need it, while also preventing unauthorized immigration for those who are not eligible for relief. And it's very difficult to design policies that do both of those things at once. It's especially difficult in the current U.S. political climate, which has been very focused in recent years on border security. So as these numbers shot up last year, this was perceived as a border crisis, even though there was really no evidence of increased illegal entries. Most of the children and families were surrendering to the first Border Patrol agent they could find. But on both sort of the left and the right, there were strong incentives to, view this in terms of a border security problem. The right wanted to prevent illegal immigrants from coming in, and the left wanted to secure the border, as part of an effort to pass a broader immigration reform. So what kind of responses were put in place? Let me mention 5 main sort of sets of reforms that we've seen since 2014 in the last year or so. One is that DHS and the White House announced a series of institutional reforms to have a better coordinated DHS-wide and U.S. government-wide response. And I'm not going to say more about that, but I can if people are interested in Q&A. Second change is that the United States and other countries in the region have done a substantial surge of enforcement resources. In the U.S. case, that meant a lot more resources to the border, new prosecution resources to go after immigrant smugglers, new detention facilities, as I mentioned, for families, more cooperation with Central America to expedite having more deportation flights. And Mexico has increased its enforcement efforts, resulting in a 3-fold increase in child immigrant apprehensions and a 2-fold increase in child deportations from Mexico. Also new enforcement efforts within Central America to prevent unauthorized exits. In terms of the adjudication process in the U.S., we've created a special docket for child and family arrivals to speed up their hearings, and the use of new technology to spread the burden across multiple immigration judges. A fourth element of the response has been a coordinated information campaign between the United States and the countries of Central America and Mexico to combat the misinformation that arriving children would be permitted to stay, and to encourage, to discourage people from making illegal trips. And then most recently, beginning in December of last year, the U.S. began a new program of in-country processing to permit children who have a parent lawfully present in the U.S. to apply for refugee status within their home countries, rather than having to get to the border to make an application. So let me now say a bit about sort of the limitations of those approaches and what we may, what we're looking at and may do about it in the future. Basically, there's 2 sort of fundamental limitations. One is that none of those policies have addressed the basic drivers of migration from Central America to the U.S. that I mentioned before. And then the second is that there's been a much greater focus on enforcement and on protection. So let me say a little bit more about each of those and sort of what we might do about it. In terms of policies to address drivers of unauthorized and humanitarian migration from the region, the big push factors are lack of security and lack of economic opportunities in the region. And, none of the sort of 5 interventions I described are even, on any level designed to go after those issues. The good news is, the bad news, why this is so important, is that as long as these push and pull factors that have been driving immigration from Central America remain in place, the core challenge of responding to mixed flows will persist. So the numbers are down right now, but with those fundamental drivers in place, we have to continue to watch and sort of ask how sustainable the current responses are. So with respect to, addressing the push factors in the region, the good news is there, a very promising development last year was that the 3 Northern Triangle countries themselves have developed and proposed this new plan for the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle. And this is a comprehensive strategy to strengthen business sectors in the region, to invest in human capital, to improve citizen security and access to justice, and to strengthen political institutions. These are basically the right sort of pillars of what kind of a development plan we'd like to see to address, those fundamental push factors. But under the best scenario, this is a long-term, expensive struggle to get these policies in place. There's a lot of questions about the ability of the countries to implement this plan, and especially, and additionally, major questions about where the financing is going to come from. The countries have limited tax bases and ability to collect resources domestically. So a lot of the money will come from outside, or will have to come from outside. But big questions about the willingness of the United States and other countries and international institutions to put up the kind of investments that are needed in infrastructure and support for the judicial system to bring this plan about. So one issue to watch for in the short term is whether Congress agrees to President Obama's request for $1 billion to support these reforms in this year's budget. This would be a huge increase. We've in recent years spent about $80 million on support for Central American Regional Security Initiative. So it would be an important down payment. It would still be, only a small share of the resources that are needed, but an important signal that the U.S. is serious about supporting this effort. The other driver that I mentioned before is family reunification pressure. So one way to address that would be changes to facilitate legal flows from Central America to the U.S. Basically, that requires legislative change to do any sort of serious and sustained expansion of legal flows from Central America, to legalize some of the Central American families so that they can sponsor family members, or to create new employment-based or family-based visas from the region. It's not likely that Congress is going to take that up this year. In the short term, we might see there are things that the president could do to parole people into the U.S., and that's an element of the in-country processing program. But for the president to take unilateral action to expand immigration from Central America would also be controversial, given the existing controversy over executive action. And then the other set of issues is how to balance enforcement and protection concerns. So I've gone over my limit. So let me just quickly say that one of the main reasons that we've seen the numbers come down almost certainly is the increased enforcement in Mexico and Central America. We have real questions about what kind of screening and adjudication is being done by those countries to identify kids who have humanitarian protection needs. So there's an issue we should be looking at is, if the U.S. is sort of outsourcing its enforcement responsibilities to Mexico and Central America, are we adequately outsourcing our protection responsibilities and making sure that those enforcement efforts have adequate humanitarian screening? And the anecdotal and media evidence so far is that screening may not be in place. And then with respect to adjudication in the U.S., even with the changes that we've made to create special dockets, the wait times for hearings in the U.S. Remain very long. The great majority of children don't have legal representation, and without legal representation, we know that they have a very little chance of a successful humanitarian claim. So we should be looking hard at reforms to the U.S. immigration court system to increase the number of judges and to increase legal representation, possibly to empower USCIS to grant asylum without going before an immigration judge. And we should also be sort of monitoring and concerned about the use of detention, because it makes it much more difficult for families to get fair immigration hearings, and alternatives to detention can produce better results at much lower cost. So I will stop there, and we can take up those in more detail during Q&A if people are interested. And I will pass the mic to Margie.
Okay, Margie is going to start in just a moment after I remind you that if there are questions that are right away on your mind now, please write them in, and we are keeping a list of them, and we'll return to them during the Q&A. And with that, Margie.
Great. Thanks, Doris, and thank you, Mark. So I'm going to just breeze through a bit of a conversation, updating us. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold here. Just talking a little bit about, what are some of the developments in terms of the settlement of UACs in different parts of the country, and what are some of the policy issues in play and solutions that have been put forward. So first, we thought we would just show you this graphic as a way to just envision the map of the states and the key counties within them, where unaccompanied children have been placed by county. This incorporates both the fiscal year 2014 and the numbers we have so far for 2015. The top states for UAC children in terms of their placement are Texas, California, New York, Florida, and then there's a bit of a bouncing back and forth between Virginia and Maryland. The ORR website, if any of you are not frequenting it, the ORR website, Office of Refugee Resettlement website, has regularly updates numbers there, including by county. That's where these numbers are drawn from. But basically, all we wanted to say with this map was that that you can see how the placement of unaccompanied children very much mirrors or overlays the settlement patterns of immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras that came to the U.S. in earlier years. Here are just the top counties for unaccompanied children who were released to sponsors, again, combining the 2014 fiscal year, federal year, along with what we have so far for 2015. What I find interesting here, in addition just to the, it's just always interesting to see local or closer to the ground local impact numbers, but even looking at a place like New York, the fact that it's not New York City, it's Suffolk County and Nassau County, that it starts to hint at some of the local impact issues that it's not necessarily the case where a lot of these children are being placed, that they're necessarily sites that are the big, well-known local areas for dealing with immigrant and refugee integration issues. So we just wanted to make sure that we set a little bit of groundwork here with just stating a little bit around what the process is for the placement of unaccompanied children. As you heard Mark's whole presentation about the various components of Department of Homeland Security that are involved in the migration end of this, children are then transferred, unaccompanied children are then transferred for care and custody to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is within the Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. ORR has a large number of short-term contracts with local agencies that then provide care and custody for these children in shelters and in residential facilities. Those who are contracted then are responsible for placement of the children with a sponsor, basing their decision on placement around least restrictive setting that's in the best interest of the child. Case managers at those shelters and residential facilities that have the short-term contracts interview prospective sponsors, verify their identity, run a background check, conduct a home visit if it's warranted, and then generally they simply within a short period of time release the children to what are most often immediate family members. I believe that the going number now is roughly 85% are placed with close family members. And then this is generally the end of contracted agency services. The children are considered are considered to be then in the care of their sponsors. There are some post-release services that are provided to certain categories of children, but generally it's really the sponsors who are then responsible for the children. So some of the state and local impacts that I'm sure many of you are familiar with or have heard about include those in the health and mental health arena. There is a health screening that's conducted by Customs and Border Patrol, and then a second one that's conducted by the ORR contracted groups for children. So some of their basic health screenings and health needs are covered through those two screenings, but then once they are placed with sponsors, there's a good deal of concern that the health and mental health issues that the children may have don't really have a firm sort of safety net underneath them, that the children are generally facing some pretty serious access issues when it comes to health and mental health services, since they're ineligible for most key health insurance programs, particularly Children's Health Insurance Program or coverage under the ACA. And so having sort of a durable solution for meeting the healthcare needs, which can be high. As you see here, Obviously, there's concerns related to the trauma that the children may have suffered as a result of their journey or the country conditions that they're coming from. There are also a lot of reports around issues in family preservation or the dynamics within families as they're reunified after being apart for a very long time, and also many reports of post-traumatic stress and other challenges related to acculturation. Perhaps one of the biggest issues that has been in the news a lot has to do with the provision of K-12 education services. I think it's about 3/4 of children are over 14 years of age of unaccompanied children. And it's really what we call a pretty severe pain point for schools when children arrive in the secondary school years. And it's partly because secondary schools have already moved to a model of providing content-oriented instruction. They're assuming that students have already achieved basic literacy, basic English language literacy, writing skills, and basic numeracy skills. And so schools are organized mainly to go deeply into content in the sciences, some of the more specific areas of mathematics instruction and the like. And so they really do stumble when they have children arrive who don't have those basic literacy skills. Most of the teachers in middle and high schools are not literacy experts, et cetera, et cetera. It's particularly difficult if the students have an interrupted formal education. Those are known as sight students because those students may have 4, 5, even more years of education that they're behind. Again, these can be difficult issues for schools to be able to meet. And then, of course, more generally, just beyond the actual instructional challenges, there are the cost challenges that many districts say that they're facing. Schools are funded mainly by state and local taxes, so there is a feeling that this is hitting states and localities directly in their pocket, in taxpayers' pocket, and so the education costs have been a major point of contention. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the provisions, the potential approaches that have been suggested for trying to meet some of those challenges. But I'll just say one last thing about some of the state and local impacts, and that is that, as we understand it, ICE is moving ahead with some RFPs for alternatives to detention involving family case management. The projects are scheduled to come online in Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City, and the D.C., Baltimore area. So as part of bringing in substantial numbers of family units who are no longer going to be held in detention, but instead, in a sense, resettled as they await adjudication of their cases, this may raise some new issues for states and localities in terms of the impacts on local services and the need for making sure that those families' needs are well met. So I just thought I would hopefully tell you a few things that maybe will make you feel a little hopeful about ways to address some of these challenges. The first is that there's something called the Emergency Immigrant Education Program. It used to be a more robust piece of funding under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was a way to provide local school districts with support for meeting the needs of recently arrived immigrant and refugee students. It sort of fell out of favor in the late 1990s because it was formula driven. There was a fairly low per pupil amount, so it was folded in to a new title under when No Child Left Behind Act was authorized in the early 2000s. But there is the possibility now, as ESCA reauthorization conversations are happening, that funding formula or the model for that funding formula could actually be reexamined and include additional funds for recently arrived students, particularly those who are coming in the secondary years and who have a lot of educational needs associated with them. Interestingly, also, there is a bill that was introduced in the House of Representatives by Representatives Israel and King from New York in September of last year. It's in a sense a version of the Emergency Immigrant Education Program called the Public School Emergency Relief Act, And what the bill would seek to do is to provide up to $12,000 per student, per immigrant student, for a range of education, health, and counseling costs. So as you can see there, I just did, a quick multiplication, thinking, well, if there are about 60,000 students, that comes out to about $720 million in terms of if one were to provide about $12,000 for each of those students. So then, turning to what actually has happened, there was a special appropriation that was included in last year's budget resolution that has resulted in $14 million for local education agencies to provide services to UAC children. So as you can see, that's a really far cry from the roughly $12,000 per student that's envisioned under HR 5611. I should say too that $12,000 is more or less the average of what is spent across the country in terms of education aid. So I just want to quickly close by pointing to one other possible solution, and that is the President's memorandum in November announced as part of his other immigration executive actions, creating a task force on new Americans and also creating a national integration plan, precisely because of the very difficult issues and challenges that secondary schools are facing with late arriving immigrant and refugee students. We recommended as part of that the federal government create a multi-stakeholder group that would get together and create goals and benchmarks for more effectively meeting the integration needs of late arriving refugee and immigrant youth, establish cost ranges for services that would be effective in supporting them in hitting the targets for educational and socio-emotional outcomes, and then suggest some new federal funding approaches for the academic and non-academic supports that these students need, with the idea that if we have simple formula funding, that we don't necessarily get at what are the actual services that students need at the local level in order to have them succeed. So in order to not have the money sort of get lost as part of larger pools of funding, have it actually be tied much more closely to what it is that we know helps those students succeed. So this is this has been recommended to the White House Task Force. Their national integration plan is expected as soon as this week, and so hopefully there'll be more opportunities to continue conversations around this and the other potential solutions in the weeks and months to come. So with that, we'll turn it over to your questions, and I'll turn things back to Doris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we've given you a lot of information, and accordingly, we have a lot of interesting questions. So we're going to try to get through as many of them as we can and apologize in advance if we can't cover them all. But let me start right out with a question for Mark, which is about detention capacity. Do you know how much detention capacity is available in the U.S. for family arrivals? Will DHS be forced to choose between releasing families who have been detained for months and not detaining newly arrived families?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's important to know that DHS can only detain family units and children in particular in special facilities that keep them isolated from non-family members and that have certain services available to them. So there are these dedicated. The Obama administration has opened 4 dedicated family facilities, one of which is now closed, but the bed capacity is now at right at around 3,700 beds. So that's a huge increase over the dozen or so beds that existed when this surge started, but it's not enough beds to accommodate all of the arriving family members. So yeah, fundamentally, those kinds of trade-offs, they will have to make those kinds of trade-offs at a certain point. So which goes back to the issue of these high service alternative to detention programs do have a local impact, but they're they're an alternative that they have a good record of getting people to show up for their removal proceedings, so they address that concern at a much lower cost than detention, and also in a more humane way.
Let me ask a follow-up to that because of the comment that you made in your presentation about the court case in Washington. How does that affect the detention of family given this capacity?
So yeah, the court case just came down last month, so we don't really have a lot of sort of follow-up data. But what the judge what the judge did was issue an injunction which said that DHS can't, as a policy matter, mandatorily detain arriving family members as part of a strategy to deter future arrivals. So that's not a valid reason to implement that policy, particularly without going through a rulemaking process to validate it. So our understanding is that families are not as routinely being detained as they were beginning last summer when these new bed spaces were put in place. So there's likely a case-by-case determination of who is a particular flight risk or for other reasons should be detained, and as Margie mentioned, efforts to begin alternatives to detention in other cases.
Okay, let's go to apprehensions, and for you also, Mark, you mentioned that apprehensions have begun to increase a little bit in the western sectors as they've and also have come down in McAllen. Do you have numbers on deportations of children that have come to the U.S.?
I do. Yes. Let me just get them. Over the last, between 2009 and 2014, it's been an average of about between 1,400 and 1,900 removals per year of unaccompanied children. So, and that's through July of 2014. And those numbers haven't so far increased proportionally to the increasing number of arrivals, but that's actually not that surprising because we know that it takes a long time for these cases to work their way through the system. So those numbers, about 1,500 or so per year, are sort of based on the earlier arrival numbers of about 25,000 UACs or less per year.
Okay, then I have one more question for Mark and then a question for Margie. Mark, on the numbers overall, talking about staying on pace to become, or not staying on pace, but still having large numbers and being likely to see the second highest level if the current rates continue. Do you expect similar resettlement patterns? And this questioner observes that so far most of those coming to the New York area have ended up in the suburbs on Long Island, which I think Margie pointed out.
So, yeah, I mean, we know in general that children, unaccompanied children are usually placed with a family member, and so they're being placed in communities that have large Central American populations because that's who their families are. So, on one hand, that means that they're being placed into a supportive environment, but it also means that they're being placed into communities that are already, sort of overtaxed, and where immigration, is already, presents some local challenges, for some of the reasons that Margie discussed.
Okay, Margie, you talked about health screening, and CBP does it, and ORR does it. This is a question about courses of action that would take place once children are with in a home placement. What kind of medical attention would these children have access to, and would they have access to immunization?
It varies very much by state and locality, what sort of health services are available locally. So if whoever has asked that question wants to write to us separately about a particular geographic area, we could maybe give a better description about what might be available in a local place, but it's really quite different from place to place. And I would say the really big concern is that there's not this safety net provided the way there is, for example, with refugees through the Refugee Medical Assistance Program or by access to the federally funded Children's Health Insurance Program. As I understand it, in terms of immunization, that is something that's supposed to be checked and completed as part of the short-term contracts that the ORR contractors have that are doing the placement. It's one of the responsibilities. So at least in theory, that's supposed to have been covered before children are actually placed with their sponsor.
That's my understanding as well. It's one of the reasons that, in fact, there is a processing period and children are not just immediately released. It is immunizations and other issues like that ORR addresses. Okay, there's a question here about the Mexican and contiguous, non-contiguous countries in terms of TVPRA. What is the reason, or is there a rationale for contiguous, non-contiguous country delineation in eligibility for TVPRA? And is there any possibility that Mexican children would be included in a more generous interpretation of TVPRA?
So, I think that probably the real answer to this question is that this was a political compromise that was struck when TVPRA was enacted. That from a humanitarian perspective, the screening that the non-contiguous countries are receive is an appropriate way to ensure that kids who need protection are getting it. And the compromise was, well, we're going to put that in place for most people, but in order to meet the enforcement concerns for Mexicans, we're not going to put it in place for them. And so, as you know, if you've been following this issue, what's been proposed by many, advocates for tougher immigration enforcement is to lower the standards for Central Americans and to treat them like the Mexican kids. There hasn't been significant pressure in Congress to raise the standards for the Mexican kids and to treat them like Central Americans. So I think, if you're concerned about ensuring humanitarian protection, that's the right agenda item for you, but I don't think that's where the debate is right now.
Let's go to in-country processing. We have a question about how it's taking place. Is it being utilized well? What are the numbers?
So this program got started in December. The latest information I'm aware of is that the numbers so far are zero, that no one has made it through this process and been admitted into the U.S. We don't have a lot of, and for that reason, we don't have a lot of data yet, but some other numbers I can share. The program is nominally capped at 4,000 children per year. That's a pierceable cap, but that's sort of the target number for the first year, is that it might admit up to 4,000 kids as refugees. Other children could also be paroled into the United States who don't meet the refugee standards, but it's only for kids who have a lawfully present parent in the U.S., and that would include both parents who have legal permanent residence as well as parents who have TPS. But in any case, we don't have data yet about how it's working because it's just now getting off the ground.
Okay, Margie, do we know how many of the sponsors are legal guardians? And it goes to the issue of school. Children cannot be vaccinated for school entry if they don't have permission from a legal guardian.
The first part of that was, do we know
how many of the sponsors are legal guardians?
Well, I've seen a few different numbers in terms of the question about how many were parents or legal guardians. I believe that that for FY 2014, there's a figure that says that from ORR that says that almost 60% were parents or legal guardians. So I think that would begin to get at that question in terms of whether the guardian was required in order for the child to be vaccinated. But I'm not sure that that's a legal requirement actually for a child to be vaccinated, if that's what the question implies.
Okay, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. We know you have other questions, so if you would like to get in touch with us separately, please feel free to do so. I want to thank you all for signing up today and for participating and joining in this discussion. We're sorry that we can't complete all of the questions that have been asked. But if there are reporters on the call who have further questions that we haven't been able to get to, please do call our Communications Director, Michelle Medelstadt, at 202-266-1910. Again, as I said earlier, the audio and the slides from the call today will be available on our website later, www.migrationpolicy.org. And finally, we will be releasing a report related to these issues later this week. It's titled Unaccompanied Child Migrants to the United States, the Tension Between Protection and Prevention. The author is Mark Rosenblum, and much of the material and more that was discussed today will be in that report. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.